The microphone hit the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the Family Feud studio. Steve Harvey had been hosting for over a decade, but he'd never dropped his microphone. Not once, not during technical difficulties, not when contestants gave outrageous answers, not even when celebrities made surprise appearances. But on this particular Thursday afternoon in Atlanta, a 12-year-old boy in a wheelchair said something that made Steve forget he was on television. What happened next broke every rule of game show protocol and reminded everyone watching that some moments are bigger than entertainment. Timothy Rodriguez sat in his bright red manual wheelchair at the edge of his family's podium, his small hands gripping the armrests with quiet determination. He wore a red hoodie that his grandmother had bought him specially for the show, blue jeans, and white sneakers that never touched the ground. His dark brown hair was neatly combed, and despite his nervous smile, there was something remarkably composed about his presence. Timothy had been born with spina bifida, a condition that left him paralyzed from the waist down, but watching him navigate the studio with confidence, you'd never know he saw it as a limitation. The Rodriguez family had traveled from San Antonio, Texas, for their chance on America's favorite game show. Maria Rodriguez, Timothy's mother, worked double shifts as a hospital nurse to support her family. His father, Carlos, was a high school janitor who took evening classes to become a teacher. Timothy's teenage sister, Isabella, was home studying for her SAT exams, but she'd made Timothy promise to win enough money for college. The family had practiced survey answers for weeks, with Timothy often surprising them with his quick wit and unexpected insights. Standing across from them at the opposing podium was the Henderson family from Nashville, Tennessee. They seemed like nice people during the pre-show introductions, but something had shifted during the actual taping. Maybe it was the pressure of the cameras, maybe it was the competitive atmosphere, but their demeanor had grown noticeably colder when they realized Timothy was participating in the game. Steve had noticed Timothy immediately during family introductions. There was something about the boy's quiet confidence that drew his attention. When Steve knelt down to Timothy's level, as he always did with younger contestants, Timothy had looked him directly in the eyes and said, "Harvey, I'm going to help my family win today." It wasn't boastful or cocky. It was stated as simple fact, delivered with the kind of certainty that made Steve smile his genuine smile, not his television smile. The game had started normally enough. Both families were evenly matched, trading answers and building momentum. Steve was in his element, working the crowd with his signature blend of humor and warmth. The studio audience was engaged, laughing at his reactions and cheering for both teams. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should for good television. But during the third round, something changed. The question was straightforward: name something that requires strength to do. The Henderson family had control of the board and had revealed several answers: lifting weights, moving furniture, opening jars. They needed one more answer to win the round and take control of the game. It was Timothy's turn to buzz in for his family. His hand shot out confidently, hitting the buzzer with a satisfying ding. "Staying positive when people doubt you," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the studio with surprising strength. The studio audience erupted in spontaneous applause. It was a beautiful answer, the kind that went beyond the surface of the question to something deeper, something real. Steve's eyebrows raised in appreciation. "That's a great answer, young man. Let's see if it's on the board." But before the answer could be revealed, something happened that changed the entire atmosphere of the studio. From the Henderson family podium came a voice, low but clearly audible in the studio's acoustic environment. "Of course the kid in the wheelchair thinks he knows about strength." It was said under breath, meant to be heard only by the Henderson family. But the studio microphones picked up every word. The comment was followed by muffled snickering from several Henderson family members. The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence, the kind of silence that happens when something crosses a line that can't be uncrossed. Timothy's answer wasn't on the board, but that no longer mattered. What mattered was that a 12-year-old boy had just been reduced to his disability by adults who should have known better. Timothy's face changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to viewers at home, but Steve saw it. The confident smile faltered. The straight shoulders slumped slightly. The boy who had looked Steve in the eye and promised to help his family win, suddenly looked very small in his wheelchair. That's when Steve Harvey stopped being a game show host. He set his cards down on his podium, deliberately. The studio was still processing what had happened, but Steve's focus had narrowed to one thing: the boy in the red hoodie who was trying very hard not to cry. Without a word to his production team, without checking with the producers, without following any protocol whatsoever, Steve walked away from his mark and headed straight toward Timothy. The Henderson family realized what was happening and began trying to backtrack, their faces suddenly showing awareness of how their comment had been received. But Steve wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Timothy, who was staring down at his hands folded in his lap. When Steve reached Timothy's wheelchair, he did something that stunned everyone in the studio. He knelt down, not the crouch that adults usually do when talking to children, not the perfunctory bend that maintains height advantage. Steve Harvey, in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, knelt on the studio floor so that he was below Timothy's eye level, looking up at him. The cameras captured every second, but by now everyone understood this wasn't about television anymore. This was about dignity, respect, and the kind of moment that defines who we are when we think no one is watching. "Timothy," Steve said softly, his voice stripped of all performance, all entertainment value. This was just Steve Harvey, the man talking to a child who needed to hear something important. "Look at me, son." Timothy raised his eyes slowly, and when he did, Steve saw exactly what he expected to see. Hurt, the kind of deep hurt that comes not from physical pain, but from being diminished by people who don't understand what strength really looks like. "I want to tell you something," Steve continued, his voice now clearly audible throughout the silent studio, "and I want everyone in this room to hear it. Your answer wasn't on that board, but it was the best answer anyone's given today. You know why?" Timothy shook his head slightly, still trying not to cry. "Because you just showed everyone in this studio what real strength looks like. Real strength isn't about your legs, son. Real strength is about your heart. And your heart, Timothy Rodriguez, that's the strongest thing I've seen in this studio today." Behind the scenes, producers were frantically trying to figure out what to do. This wasn't in any script. This wasn't part of the show format, but the cameras kept rolling because everyone understood they were witnessing something important. Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that caught the studio lights. A small, folded piece of paper, his personal business card. He pressed it into Timothy's hand, closing the boy's fingers around it gently. "This has my personal phone number on it," Steve said. "Not my manager's number, not my agent's number, mine. I want you to call me, Timothy. Not because you're on my show, but because you're exactly the kind of young man this world needs. Smart, brave, and strong in all the ways that really matter." But Steve wasn't finished. Still kneeling, he began to remove his suit jacket. The same jacket he wore for every taping, the one that had become part of his television persona. He stood up slowly and with infinite gentleness, draped it over Timothy's shoulders. The jacket was enormous on Timothy's 12-year-old frame, hanging past his waist like a royal robe. But wearing it, Timothy somehow looked bigger, not smaller. "This jacket has been with me for every Family Feud I've ever hosted," Steve announced, his voice now carrying to every corner of the studio. It's been part of victories and defeats, laughter and tears. But today, it's going home with someone who understands what victory really means. The studio audience rose to their feet in spontaneous applause, not the prompted applause of television, but the kind of recognition that happens when people witness genuine humanity in action. Steve turned to address the Henderson family directly. His voice was calm, but carried an authority that made it clear he was no longer the entertaining host they'd met during rehearsal. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his gaze never leaving the Henderson family podium, "I want to make something very clear. This young man has more strength in his little finger than most people have in their entire body. He gets up every morning and faces a world that sometimes doesn't understand him, and he does it with grace, intelligence, and a smile. That's not disability, that's ability at its highest level." The Henderson family looked uncomfortable, shifting on their feet, clearly aware that their thoughtless comment had created a moment they couldn't take back. But Steve wasn't done. He walked back to the center of the stage, positioning himself between both family podiums. "We're going to do something different today," he announced. "We're going to finish this game, but we're going to finish it right. Henderson family, I'm going to give you a chance to show me and everyone watching what kind of people you really are." The studio held its breath. This was uncharted territory for everyone. "Timothy," Steve called out, "I want you to ask the Henderson family a question. Any question you want." Timothy looked surprised, then thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong. "I want to know if they think being different makes someone worth less." The question hung in the air like a challenge and an opportunity combined. The Henderson family patriarch, a man in his 50s who had seemed so confident earlier, now looked genuinely ashamed. "No," he said simply, his voice carrying across the studio. "No, it doesn't. And I'm sorry we made you feel like it did. You're absolutely right about strength, son. We were wrong. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming." The Henderson family, as one unit, left their podium and walked across the stage to Timothy. The grandmother knelt down next to his wheelchair. The teenage grandson extended his hand for a fist bump. The father, who had made the thoughtless comment, looked Timothy in the eyes and said, "You're the strongest person in this room, and I'm honored to meet you." What happened next was pure magic. Steve made an unprecedented decision. "Both families win today," he announced, "because today we learned something more valuable than any prize money. We learned that strength comes in all forms, that differences make us stronger, not weaker, and that sometimes the most important victories happen when we choose kindness over competition." The episode that aired 3 months later became the most watched Family Feud episode in the show's history. But more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about inclusion, dignity, and what it means to truly see each other. Timothy Rodriguez returned to San Antonio, wearing Steve's jacket and carrying more than just a business card. He carried the knowledge that his voice mattered, that his presence made a difference, that his strength was recognized and celebrated. 6 months later, Timothy started a peer support group for children with disabilities. A year later, he was invited to speak at his school's graduation ceremony. His speech, delivered while wearing Steve's jacket, began with the words, "Real strength isn't about what your body can do, it's about what your heart chooses to do." Steve Harvey kept his promise. He called Timothy regularly, not for publicity, not for content, but because some connections transcend television. When Timothy graduated from high school, as valedictorian 3 years later, Steve was there in the audience, beaming with pride. The jacket became more than a garment. It became a symbol of recognition, of dignity defended, of the moment when entertainment stepped aside and humanity took center stage. Timothy had it framed alongside Steve's business card, and a photo from that day in the studio. 3 items that told the story of when a game show became something sacred. And the Henderson family? They became some of Timothy's biggest supporters, learning that sometimes our worst moments can become catalysts for our best selves. They attended Timothy's high school graduation too, cheering louder than anyone when he crossed the stage in his wheelchair, wearing Steve's jacket over his graduation gown. Years later, Steve Harvey would say in interviews that Timothy's episode changed how he approached every show, every contestant, every moment he spent in front of those cameras. That boy taught me something I thought I already knew, Steve reflected. He taught me that the most important thing I can do isn't make people laugh. It's help them see each other, really see each other. The business card Steve gave Timothy that day was never used for a phone call. Timothy kept it as a reminder that recognition and respect were his by right, not by charity. But the promise it represented lived on in every interaction Timothy had afterward, every moment he chose confidence over doubt, every time he rolled into a room and knew he belonged there. Because that's what happened in that studio on a Thursday afternoon in Atlanta. A 12-year-old boy in a wheelchair reminded everyone watching that strength isn't measured by what your body can do. It's measured by what your spirit refuses to let anyone take away. And sometimes, just sometimes, the whole world is watching when someone chooses to see that strength and honor it. Steve Harvey dropped his microphone that day, but what he picked up was something far more valuable: the understanding that the most powerful moments in television happen when we stop performing and start caring, when we stop entertaining and start healing, when we stop being hosts and start being human. Timothy Rodriguez taught a studio full of adults what courage looks like. Steve Harvey taught them what compassion sounds like, and together they proved that the best television happens when real life breaks through the script and reminds us all what we're capable of when we choose love over fear, inclusion over exclusion, and recognition over ignorance. The microphone was picked up within seconds, but the impact of what happened when it fell continues to resonate, reminding us all that sometimes the most important words aren't spoken into microphones at all. They're spoken heart to heart, person to person, in moments when someone decides that another person's dignity matters more than any game, any prize, any applause. That's not entertainment. That's humanity. And that's what happens when a 12-year-old boy teaches the world what strength really means.